private affair, secret, that these people see themselves as a vanguard because they are in touch personally with the god.
Right. So that's,
and I think it's the same thing in rock and roll. That rock and roll has been a series. Rhythm and blues starts off in the late 40s and becomes popularized, becomes rockabilly, becomes rock and roll. There are all these sort of innovations. But then you have this break because by the early 60s, the record companies, the producers are back in control. We have the girl groups, we have Motown, we have the teen idols. And then what do we have next? We have the blues, the blues revival. You see, it's the same thing. It's the same process. It's just almost like a microcosm or even maybe a mirror that the rhythm and blues was radical and revolutionary in the 40s, but by the early 60s has been blanderized, has been slicked up. You have people like Berry Gordy, you have people like Phil Spector that are taking everything and just turning it into this mush. And that's when the Beatles come in, and the Rolling Stones, and the British Invasion, and the blues, and the garage bands, and the early punk bands, that it's very much a reaction against that. And then, successively, as each sort of movement comes to the fore, the psychedelic movement was very close on the heels of the British blues and rock and roll revival. And then following that was the progressive movement. And then following that was the metal movement. And then following that was glam. Then following that was punk. You see what I'm saying? Is that we have these very short periods. Things are moving very quickly. And this is what I call the classic age of rock. And the way I define this is that I start with the Beatles album, Rubber Soul, and I sort of end it with Nirvana's Nevermind, that there's this period where there's this consensus, that there's this understanding, that there's not the fragmentation that we see with the internet, with MP3 players, with all these sort of things, that, there is a mainstream and a counterculture. There's a clear line of demarcation between that. Yeah. And again, this is the same thing that we saw, that you would have the Zeus cult or the Apollo cult. These are the official cults of state, but then we'd have Dionysus, which is very much a rebellion, which is very much frowned upon by the authorities, which is violently put down by both the Greeks and the Romans, that this is something that is rebellious. Even though Dionysus is seen as a god of the pantheon, he's accepted, as a god who has a role in the pantheon and the cult of state. His cult is very much rebellious, countercultural, and seen as a threat to the established order. Because anytime you had groups meeting in secret, particularly in Rome, the inference would be that there was a political revolution stirring. This is something that the Romans were continuously paranoid about, because you had the same group of families ruling Rome for thousands of years, hundreds of years. They were constantly terrified because there was only a small sort of crust of citizens, and then the mass of slaves and non-citizens and people who aren't free. The threat of rebellion is something that's constantly on the Romans' minds, and that's why a lot of these mystery cults, the Isis cult, the Dionysus cult, the Galoi, who are priests of Cybele, even though these gods might be accepted, their cults often are not. And I think it's the same thing in rock and roll, that punk was part of rock and roll, was part, these groups were all signed to the major record labels and stuff, but these groups were very much seen as threats. And, this is something I remember. I mean, I did a big article in a group called the Plasmatics, and this was a group that was, these people were beaten by the police, they were hounded by the authorities, they eventually broke up because they couldn't play anywhere anymore. They were literally driven out of existence by the establishment. And that's not something, that didn't happen with the Sex Pistols. You can sort of tell how effective a group is by how the authorities react to it.
So that's very interesting to me as well, because this connects us with this idea that some of the music, scene have potentially then been controlled also by the powers that be, that certain groups are allowed to be out there, certain, groups are promoted almost, in that sense, and they do that in order to maybe potentially call the real thing, but then offer you something, a false version of that, but it's, at least it comes from a point of view where it has been, sanitized by the powers that be in one way. And maybe the same thing, that parallel then can be made to the ancient cults as well, that when the state realize if you connect this with revolution that you mentioned, Chris, then this becomes a powerful and dangerous thing for the powers that be. So they have an interest in controlling these and making sure that they know what's going out there, or what is going on out there rather. But what can you say in terms of the music scene and certain groups being controlled from behind the scenes by the powers that be? Do you see that at all?
Well, I'll tell you have to sort of go back in history to sort of, when those threats rise up, how they are dealt with. Let's start in the 50s. That we have Elvis, we have Jerry Lee Lewis, we have Little Richard, very much seen as a threat. And let's not forget that there are establishments. There are various groups, within the establishment, that there isn't this monolithic establishment, that there are almost sects within the established order that are constantly sort of struggling
fighting
for control over each other.
Right,
yes.
Right.
So in the 50s, rock and roll was very much seen as a threat, very much seen as usurpation of the status quo, by certain groups. Maybe certain groups within the power structure are more tolerant of it, but certainly in the South, among that anti-communist, real hardcore right wing that rises up in the 50s, see this as like a Bolshevik plot. And then, rock and roll sort of hits the scene, and then it's sort of almost, very quietly, but very effectively put down. Elvis is drafted into the army. This is a huge thing. You take the #1 rock and roll star and you take him out of circulation. This was not accidental. Little Richard,
and you make him into a military drone, if you will, in one way.
Yeah, and when he comes out of the military, he's completely neutered. He's completely defanged. He's declawed. He's not the same Elvis. So that's a huge thing. You can get very conspiratorial about this. You had the day the music died. Buddy Holly, the Big Bopper, and Ritchie Valens are killed in a plane crash.
Yeah.
Jerry Lee Lewis is sort of hounded out of the public eye when he marries his cousin, which is sort of very common in his cultural milieu. He was completely shocked that anybody would be outraged that he would marry his 13-year-old cousin, because that's what they did. Little Richard all of a sudden quits to become a minister. I think that he was probably blackmailed. This is certainly a conspiracy theory, but somebody who needs attention and adulation as much as Little Richard to quit rock and roll at the height of his popularity, to me, doesn't jibe. We have Eddie Cochran being killed in a car accident. One by one, whether through Elvis being drafted, several rock stars dying in plane crashes or car crashes, or just sort of being hounded out of popularity, out of the limelight, that all of a sudden, by the end of the 50s, rock and roll is done. People think it's over. And all of a sudden we see the folk acts. We see the Kingston Trio. We see Peter, Paul, and Mary. We, the Four Freshmen. It's a much different scene. It's much more collegiate. It's very toothless. But we also see the producers again take over. We see Phil Spector and Berry Gordy really sort of start to dictate what will be popular. It's not quite rock and roll. It's not quite soul. It's pop. This is the rise of pop. And then we also have Fabian and Dion and, you know, the teen idols, you know, these sort of scrubbed down versions of rock and roll. Again, so I mean, you had a period where rock and roll sort of bursts out of nowhere, but then all of a sudden, again, it's obviously being put down. And then it rises back up in the 60s. But the same thing happens again where, you know, the Beatles, you know, we have the record burnings in 1966. We have the Stones being sort of hounded by the authorities. I mean, they can't go anywhere without being chased by vice cops and drug squad and all that kind of thing. You know, we have the FBI starting files on, you know, Jim Morrison, Janis Joplin, Jimi Hendrix, John Lennon. All four of those people die, you know, young. So I think it doesn't quite work in the sort of master plan, grand hidden hand way that some people might think. It's very much, you know, how things work in the real world. It's messy, but it can also be quite effective. That the original rock and rollers are seen as too sexual. And really, the criticism of rock and roll in the early days is that it's too black, that it's race music. Because you got to remember, at the same time that rock and roll is heating up, the civil rights movement is heating up. And I mean, look what happened to the civil rights leaders. I mean, it's you know, I wouldn't say that this is the government, quote unquote, but there are definitely certain factions within the power structure who are very much threatened by this. And you know, like again, we see. Watered down, we see Cliff Richard and Pat Boone. I mean, Pat Boone is a member of the Council on National Policy, who are, you know, big, you know, Dominionist think tank. And he's the guy who's put up, you know, he's covering all of Little Richard's songs to sort of, you know, bland it down. You know, there's this constant struggle of the real thing, and it's what the establishment wants. The establishment wants a watered down version of it. So
again, I mean, what that implies in some extent, and even if we, you know, take your idea into account that it's not a, you know, it's a super, you know, centralized plan in that sense from the powers that be to control it. There certainly can be factions within this who realize that, okay, these musicians and their ideas they're dangerous and they need to be controlled in one way. Alex Constantine, another researcher who have been doing some, you know, researching Jimi Hendrix, for instance, into this as well, connects the COINTELPRO program with this, started by, you know, J. Edgar Hoover, and that they might have been behind, you know, the murder of Jimi Hendrix. And there's, you know, plenty of it as well, murdered musicians. And you go into some of those aspects too in the book, what's known as the 27 Club, and there's other, so many people. You sent me this long list, Chris, as well, in terms of when this started, all the way back to Blind Lemon Jefferson, you know, in way back, so to speak, that musicians have been taken off, you know, one by one here and there. So, do you think then that is a conspiracy? That it's someone has been trying to pick off these people and then giving us a more sanitized version of it later? They repackage it in some way, the music that have been put out there. What do you think?
Let's say this. I mean, you know, we can speculate, but what we can say with certainty is a lot of the most charismatic and powerful figures in rock and roll and in soul and in reggae. You know, we think of people like Bob Marley. People who could change people's opinions, people who are seen as leaders, you know, are somehow, you know, they're either killed or they're disgraced or they're bought out, you know, they're neutralized in some way.
Yeah.
We also have, you know, it's funny because a lot of people forget these names, but we also have this whole movement to create an ersatz rock and roll. An ersatz, you know, even in the 60s, there was a group like Up With People, which is this whole, you know, it was this big chorus group. You know, there were a lot of these sort of phony psychedelic groups. You know, it's this constant need to smooth off the rough edges to present something that isn't going to threaten